This lecture is on Qur'anic interpretation in the modern period. There are a number of approaches to interpreting the Qur'an today. In this lecture, we will be looking at 4 different approaches to interpreting the Qur'an very briefly: modernist, Salafi, political Islamist, and neo-modernist. Of course, there are many other approaches. The idea is to give you a sense that Muslims in the modern period approach questions of interpretation of the Quran somewhat differently, and that there are many approaches. Of course, the classical approaches to interpretation of the Quran continues. So what we are talking about is something in addition to that. Let us look at the modernity and its context. We live in the modern period with new ways of looking at the world, new institutions, new values, new norms, new ways of governance, new ways of managing the economy, mass education, and the like. We live in a different world to what existed before the modern period in many ways. When does the modern period begin? Well, it all depends. When we talk about the modern period, as far as Islamic thought is concerned, we are looking at the mid-19th century onwards, roughly 1850s onwards. From the late 18th century onwards, European influence on the world was enormous, not just intellectually, but also politically and militarily. Whether or not we agree with it, European influence on the world became extremely important. Part of that was European ideas, its emphasis on things like reason, science, knowledge, technology, and also the idea of progress. But there was also a crisis in Europe as far as religion was concerned. Christianity was still very important, but tension had developed around it over some time. All these ideas came to have an impact on what we call the Muslim world. Really, by that I mean the regions where Muslims were present or are present in significant numbers in places like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Europeans came into contact with Muslims militarily, politically, and economically, largely through colonialism: British, French, Italian, and so forth. The colonial powers were powerful, and this power spread across the rest of the world in much of the late 19th century, and of course in various areas before that as well. The issue for us is that these events influenced Muslims both positively and negatively, and had a significant role to play in 20th century Muslim thinking and scholarship. It also extended to what we are discussing in this subject, that is Quranic interpretation. Apart from the political, economic, and military impact, the rise of mass education with its emphasis on secular education, not just religious education, is also significant. We don't have time to go into the details of this modern context and analyze that. But I just wanted to highlight the importance of thinking about this modern context when we explore the question of Quranic interpretation today. Let us look at early Muslim responses to this modernity. So, when Europeans came into contact with Muslim societies through the colonial project, particularly in the late 19th century, there were quite a lot of attractions in this project for many Muslims. Side by side, there was also a significant level of resistance and opposition to the Europeans and their ideas in these Muslim societies. Many Muslims were interested in the ideas Europeans had to offer, in the ways in which they were doing things. The idea of what we might call westernization became very attractive to a good number of Muslims, particularly young Muslims. One reaction to Western ideas in Muslim societies was to ask, where are we? It was a question leading to thoughts of change and talk about reform. Reform of what? Reform of the way Muslims had been doing things, including governance, management of their societies, and education, for example. Reform and modernization became important concerns for what we might call Muslim modernists. They were quite comfortable with the modern world. They wanted to change things and follow European ways of doing things. The other response was to look backwards. Some Muslims thought the new European ideas and ways of doing things were simply not Islamic or un-Islamic. Ideas about religion and society, role of religious law in society, managing education institutions, governments, lending, borrowing, and finance in general, just to name a few, seem to be quite problematic for many Muslims. Many such ideas and ways of doing things seemed to be contrary to traditionally held Islamic ideas about these matters. The response from this particular group of Muslims was, by and large, rejection of what Europeans had to offer, and instead to rely on the traditionally transmitted ideas and to see to what extent they would work in the modern world. Islamic modernism is one response to this modernity. We might say the more reformist and perhaps positive response. In some ways, ideas of reform and change existed even in the late 18th century in various parts of the Muslim world and became more visible in the 19th century, particularly in places like the Indian subcontinent and Egypt. The modernist outlook was not so much a movement but a broad orientation. Let us not forget also that the idea of renewal and reform and change has always been part and parcel of Islamic tradition. Let us look at some key modernist figures. So, who were these Muslim modernists? Here we have a number of those modernist figures. This is Jamaluddin al-Afghani, a very important modernist figure, lived in Egypt. Here we have Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan from India, and this is Muhammad Abdu from Egypt. Afghani lived in Egypt for a long time and influenced the famous Egyptian scholar Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu was from Egypt. Rashid Rida, his student, is also important in this context. So you can see figures like Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and Rashid Rida are closely connected. They are all connected to what we call Middle East. And Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is from the Indian subcontinent. These two places will remain important in our discussion on Islamic modernity. There is also another figure whose name is Abul Kalam Azad, a modernist from India or in the Indian subcontinent. Other scholars associated with this broad trend include scholars such as Mustafa al-Maraghi, Mahmoud Shaltut, both from Egypt, and also the famous commentator on the Qur'an who is known as Hamka from Indonesia. There are many others too, but we can cite these just as examples. They all had slightly different ideas about lots of things, but what brought them together was this modernist outlook and their interest in reform and new ideas. As you can see, they existed in different parts of the Muslim world. Let us look at the modernist outlook. The modernists saw Islam as compatible with things like science and reason. They looked back into history and saw that this was how Muslims functioned in the past. very comfortable with philosophical and scientific thought. So for them, there is no reason why Muslims can't follow the same path of new ideas, reform and change, and new ways of thinking. Modernists wanted to reconcile new ideas that Europeans brought with their understanding of what Islam was all about. This is not about rejecting the religion of Islam. It is not also about reforming Islam, so to speak. A good number of these modernist scholars were traditionally trained in Islamic religious disciplines. Many were religious leaders. So their interest was really about coming to terms with modernity, but remaining as Muslims and living in a very different modern environment. They were prepared to rethink some of the old ideas if needed. It was perhaps the spirit of the time. Modernists also wanted to revive what they called the true spirit of Islam. What was this true spirit of Islam? For modernists, the true spirit of Islam can be found in the simpler Islam that existed at the time of the Prophet. They looked to this simple but extremely vibrant Islam in contrast to the Islam that had developed by their time with its massive legal systems and theological ideas and a whole lot of cultural practices that seemed rather foreign to the Islam at the time of the Prophet. The modernists were not comfortable with the barriers that Muslims had erected between various Muslim schools of thought, be they legal, theological, or any other. Modernists were happy to accept and accommodate different legal schools, for example. They didn't like the idea that Muslims had to be restricted to following a particular school of law. For example, Shafi, Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, or Jafari. They said that there was no need for that type of restriction. For them, if you're a Muslim, you should have the freedom to follow any school of law or theology you want, as long as these schools are part of the mainstream Muslim thought. For these modernists, a lot of detailed rules, regulations, and laws that were developed by Muslims in the past were in need of rethinking when and where necessary. For them, many of these laws and rules and regulations were not necessarily based on clear instructions from the Qur'an or the Prophet. For them, these rules were based, in many cases, on legal reasoning and therefore should be subject to change. Modernists wanted to free up that space and to emphasize general principles and broader objectives in law rather than specific rules. This would allow them to renew and reform traditional Islamic law and, of course, theology in line with modern expectations and norms, without, of course, sacrificing the very fundamental principles and practices and beliefs of the religion. In the area of theology, for example, modernists argued that Muslims didn't need to be obsessed with the theological systems that had developed historically. They wanted to open things up to new ideas in both law and theology. Of course, modernists were very interested also in classical Muslim theological thought with its emphasis on reason. And you can see this in a lot of modernist writings, the emphasis on reason. As far as Sufism, this is the mystical tradition of Islam. As far as Sufism was concerned, the modernists saw Sufism as a largely superstitious movement that was backward looking. Many modernists believed that Sufis or Muslim mystics had no particular interest in progress or change. For them, Sufis were practicing something that was, from their point of view, contrary to what they considered to be proper Islam. We should be very careful in not labeling all Sufis as this. For modernists, it's a certain kind of Sufism that was problematic. Sufism that was interested in spiritual matters, as long as they did not go to extremes, seemed to be perfectly fine. Let us look at modernist approaches to the Quran. As far as the Quran was concerned, modernists argued that the Quran was not really a book of detailed laws, rules, and regulations. It was primarily a book of general moral, spiritual, and ethical guidance. This again would free up Muslims from a whole area of rules and regulations. Modernists wanted to open up Muslims' understanding of the Quran by putting less emphasis on traditional methods of interpretation. So, what were these traditional methods of interpretation? A very key part of this was an emphasis on linguistic analysis of the text and lots of focus on using hadith to interpret the text. From the modernist point of view, linguistic analysis was, if you take it to extremes, a distraction from understanding the Quran. Obviously, some linguistic analysis is important for understanding the text, but perhaps for them there was too much of that in the classical tradition of Quranic interpretation. Modernists also emphasized things like the occasions of the revelation and ideas about abrogation. Occasions of revelation are really about reports that seemed to suggest that certain texts of the Quran were revealed in relation to a particular situation or circumstances or an event. Abrogation is very much about cancelling one ruling by another, one Quranic ruling by a later ruling. These ideas seemed to be important for modernists because they seemed to relate the Quranic text to its historical context. Let us look at one modernist by way of example. Muhammad Abdu from Egypt died 1905. Muhammad Abdu saw the Quran as practical guidance for people. He believed the Quran shouldn't be looked at as a technical or legal text. The Quran provides broad guidance that is relevant to the needs of the time. So Abdu had a problem with how some Quranic commentators approached the Quran and how they focused on very technical, linguistic, theological, or legal matters in the Quran. For Abdu, this kind of technical information would be confusing to the Muslim, the average Muslim, and may not be accessible to the average person. The Quran, according to Abdu, should be accessible to everybody. This means that interpretation of the Quran had to be simplified for the average Muslim. Commentators should be paying less attention to technical details and more attention to communicating the basic message of the Quran to the people. For Muhammad Abdu, Islam was compatible with science and reason. The big debates in the 19th century and early 20th century about science versus reason was not a problem for Islam. There is a commentary attributed to Abdu, that is a Quranic commentary, which was documented by his student Rashid Rida, who also added his own views. In a sense, this commentary is based on the lectures Muhammad Abdu gave, which his student Rashid Rida then documented and added his own views. When you look at this commentary, you will see that when you have a Quranic verse dealing with a particular social issue, for example, there is a lengthy discussion moving away from traditional approaches to interpreting similar texts. You can also see it as very accessible in terms of the language used. It doesn't get into technical discussions of grammar and theology or law. Let us look at one of the examples Abdu deals with in relation to politics. In the area of politics, for instance, Quran chapter 42 verse 38 says, "And their affairs are conducted by mutual consultation." Here, "there" refers to Muslims or believers. Now, how would you read a text like this? Their affairs are conducted by mutual consultation. The Quran doesn't provide a blueprint for Muslims as far as governance is concerned. There is no model of what a Muslim state should look like, what governance should look like. What does it provide as far as governance is concerned? The Quran says, very briefly, Muslims must manage their affairs with justice and fairness and consultation. But the question is, how do you do consultation? Consultation in the early Islamic period involved elders getting together to consult about matters and decide on things. In the modern period, what should we do? As far as states are concerned, we have parliaments and we vote for elected representatives. Well, this could be a form of consultation today. So Abdu says there is no particular form of Islamic government or Islamic consultation as far as governance is concerned that is specified in the Quran or in the traditions of the Prophet. He says it is up to Muslims to work out how they are going to be governed. So, for him, ideas about governance can be adopted from the Europeans if need be. Again, in chapter 4, verse 83 of the Quran, there is a reference to those people who are in authority or those in authority. Let me read the verse. "And when there comes to them information about public security or fear, they spread it around. But if they had referred it back to the messenger or to those of authority among them, then the ones who can draw correct conclusions from it would have known about it." This is chapter 4, verse 83. The verse makes reference to those in authority or those of authority. But who are those of authority? For a modernist Muslim scholar like Muhammad Abdu, it could be the parliament. That's a new interpretation. Let us look at polygamy as an example. On the issue of polygamy, Abdu and Rida, his student, basically seems to say that polygamy could be problematic today. A man marrying more than one wife. When you read the Quranic verses, uh, the relevant Quranic verses, they would say you don't get the idea that polygamy was or should be the norm in Muslim societies. I mean, even in the past. Let us look at chapter 4, verse 3. And it says, this is very much in the context of marrying more than one person, one wife. "But if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only one, or those your right hand possesses. This is more suitable that you may not incline to injustice." Basically, it is saying that, well, under certain circumstances, you are allowed to marry more than one, but that is only if you can be just and fair to the wives. But if you cannot be just, and then you should marry only one. For Muhammad Abduh, this idea of marrying more than one wife is not a natural state of affairs. It doesn't have to be for him. Because of this reasoning, Abdu argued that polygamy perhaps could be restricted because polygamy appears to be context dependent. And Abdu said this, and I quote, "Polygamy, although permitted in the Holy Quran, is a concession to necessary social conditions, which was given with the greatest reluctance, inasmuch as it was accompanied by the proviso that a man may marry more than one wife only when he is able to care for all and give to each her rights with impartiality and justice." The practical impossibility of doing so indicates that the divine law, in its intent, contemplated monogamy as the original and ideal state of marriage. So for Abdul, his idea was that monogamy was the ideal. The Quran only gives permission for polygamy in a certain context and with certain restrictions. So, to provide a summary of the modernist approach to Quranic interpretation, we can say the following. For the modernists, in interpreting the Quran, it was important to keep in mind that there was a need to reconcile Islam with modern ideas. For them, the Quran should be seen as a source of practical guidance that is accessible to all Muslims, and there should be less emphasis on traditional methods of interpretation and more emphasis on reflecting on the Quran where possible. And one should really move away from classical, legal, theological, and mystical obsession with certain texts as far as tafsir is concerned. There are, of course, many other features, but this gives you a sense of a modernist approach to the Quranic text and interpretation. Obviously, modernists did not argue that trying to understand the language and linguistic analysis were not important. They were, of course, important, but their concern was that the basic messages of the Quran should be given priority to technical, linguistic, legal, or theological analysis of the text. Let us now look at Salafism. The word Salafi is associated with the idea of the Salaf, Salaf. But what is the Salaf? Well, the word Salaf refers to the earliest Muslims, the first, second, and third generation of Muslims, approximately. For a Salafi, that is someone who belongs to Salafism, these three generations are the best examples of Muslims as far as what Islam is concerned and how one should practice Islam. This is supported by a tradition of the Prophet which says, the best generation is mine, then the following generation, then the following generation. So, based on this, a Salafi would say that if you're looking for the generations or generation that practiced Islam in the best way possible, that would be those three generations, that is, the earliest Muslims. Muslims who are associated with this idea of going back to the earliest generations of Muslims existed throughout Muslim history. But those people were not referred to as Salafi at the time. What we call Salafism today is a relatively modern thing. It is a movement that emerged in the modern period that tried to move away from strict adherence to particular legal or theological schools and move back to the two most important sources of Islam, that is, the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. For them, if one wants to practice Islam, then these two sources should be really sufficient. There is no need for one to be obsessed with a particular legal school or a particular theological school. These legal or theological schools or mystical orders, from their point of view, might have accumulated over time ideas and practices that might not be necessarily properly supported by the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. Therefore, it would be safer to rely on these two sources for the purpose of practicing Islam and understanding basic Islamic beliefs, values, and practices. Salafis wanted to purify Islam from what they call innovations in the modern period. That is, they wanted to get rid of things that were added to Islam and purify that. So one could say that modern Salafism, in part, is a reaction to the legalist mindset and Sufism that was so dominant in the Muslim regions in the last century or so. Of course, there were other concerns of Salafism but this gives you a rough idea of what Salafism is concerned about. However, modern day Salafism comprises many trends under that umbrella term. If you put all the Salafis on a continuum, there are Salafis in the mainstream as far as Islamic thought is concerned, and there are Salafis on the extreme. Think of Salafis who are apolitical and very much against the use of violence in the name of religion and quite moderate in their thinking and behavior, in Arabic meaning wasati, Wasati. And these people, these Salafis, do exist, and in terms of numbers, they would also form a significant part of the Salafi population. But there are also other people who call themselves Salafis but pro-violence. In fact, they're comfortable with extreme violence. You might like to think of groups like Al Qaeda or similar groups who emerged in the Muslim world, particularly towards the end of the 20th century and continued into the 21st century, under the banner of Salafi jihadis, for example. One example is the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which has also a significant Salafi component. So a significant part of the Salafi population would be pretty mainstream, and but there are other Salafis who might not be part of the mainstream. In fact, for most Muslims, they would be considered extreme. Let us look at law and theology. As far as laws, rules, and regulations are concerned in Islamic tradition, Salafis are very comfortable with what the Qur'an and Hadith may have to say on such an issue, a particular legal issue. For them, too much obsession with technical legal methodology in deriving such rules is perhaps unnecessary. And also, following a particular school of law is not important for Salafis. In theology, Salafis were very much against the idea of using logic and philosophy and other associated disciplines in theological debates. They usually want to read what the Quran says or what the Hadith says on a particular theological issue and simply follow that. In theological matters, Salafis tend to be rather literalist. They also place more emphasis on certain aspects of what is referred to as Tawheed, that's an Arabic term, Tawhid, or God's unity or oneness of God. Any practices among Muslims that might seem to contradict this oneness of God or unity of God from their point of view should be challenged. For example, based on the notion of God's unity, one of the requirements for Muslims is to direct one's prayer to God only and no one else. If a Muslim visits, for example, a shrine or a tomb of what many refer to as a saint and prays to that saint, this would be considered a problem, a significant theological problem. For the Salafis, by directing one's prayer to someone other than God, the Muslim has committed the unforgivable sin of shirk, Shirk, meaning shirk means associating other beings with God. Prayer should be only directed towards God and no one else. Practices like visiting tombs, praying at particular shrines are very common among many Muslims in many parts of the world. Salafis today are at the forefront of challenging such practices. Another example related to theology is some of the old debates in Islamic tradition about whether one can accept the anthropomorphic descriptions of God. That is, whether one should affirm such human terms when talking about God. For example, if there is a Quranic verse that says or makes reference to the face of God or hand of God, the Salafis would want to affirm that, but they also would say, we don't know what kind of face God has or what kind of hand God has. Most other Muslims would be more comfortable in understanding such phrases in metaphorical terms. For Salafis, this is wrong. For Salafis, Sufism or the mystical tradition of Islam is a significant problem. Salafis, generally speaking, reject Sufism and Sufi practices, and for Salafis, such practices are considered often an unacceptable innovation. These practices include, for example, veneration of saints, visiting their tombs and shrines, praying there, and also particular kinds of remembrance of God, or what is called zikr, dhikr, and particular formulas and particular formats for different kinds of prayers. All these types of practices that have developed in Islamic tradition within the mystical orders would be considered unacceptable innovations. The idea of innovation, or in Arabic, bid'ah, is a big thing in Salafism. Bid'ah means innovation in religious matters. The idea is that Prophet Muhammad and the Quran actually provided the way religion should be practiced, and one shouldn't add to that. Adding to that is an unacceptable innovation. So for Salafis, you're not supposed to innovate or create new rituals or new ways of doing things as far as religious practices are concerned. Let us look at briefly at Salafi approaches to the Quran. A lot of Salafis are very comfortable in going back to some earlier scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328. Ibn Taymiyyah was a very famous figure who wrote many works. He was encyclopedic in his knowledge and is extremely influential today. In his time, he had a lot of enemies. Lots of scholars rejected his ideas, sometimes for being too extreme. He was a very complex figure, but for our purposes, he is a key figure from the past who is revered by Salafis. Ibn Taymiyyah's student Ibn Kathir wrote a commentary on the Quran, and this commentary is widely available in English on the internet. In fact, we will be looking at this tafsir too. Tafsir means a commentary on the Quran. Perhaps I should say that this tafsir or this commentary is one of the most widely used commentaries today. When you read Ibn Kathir's commentary on the Quran, you will find lots of emphasis on hadith. He is mostly focused on explaining the meaning of the Quran or Quranic texts by using other Quranic verses or hadith. There is also less emphasis on linguistic analysis and no emphasis on mystical interpretation. He is not really interested in that. Through such works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir, Salafism has become quite influential today. Of course, there are many factors that led to the spread of Salafism in the 20th century, and we don't have time to go into that. Salafis rely heavily in their interpretation. Salafis rely heavily in their interpretation of the Quran on what we might call interpretation of the Quran by the Quran, or interpretation of the Quran by Hadith. They are less interested in linguistic analysis, and literalism is very important for the Salafis. Metaphorical reading of certain types of texts would be considered problematic. Let us now look at political Islamism or Islamism. Political Islamists bring together certain ideas from Salafism and certain ideas from modernism. Political Islam emerged in the 20th century in places like Indian subcontinent and Egypt. Modernism too emerged in these two places. So there is a connection between modernism and political Islam, and between Salafism and political Islam. Consider political Islamism as influenced by modernist ideas and Salafi ideas, but with an emphasis on politics. Their projects are about the Islamization of societies and creating Islamic states or Islamic socio-political orders. But political Islamism has within it lots of different groups, movements, and individuals with very different ideas about what an Islamic state is or what an Islamic socio-political order would look like. So, who are the political Islamists? Well, political Islamism is on a continuum or can be on a continuum, the mainstream and extreme. On the extreme, there are political Islamists like those associated with the so-called Islamic State or the ISIS or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS is an expression of political Islamism or Islamism, but a very extreme version. There are also more mainstream political Islamists, such as those associated with the mainstream elements of Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt and the Jamaat Islami of Pakistan. Jamaat Islami in Pakistan is a political Islamist movement that emerged on the Indian subcontinent. It was led by Maulana Maududi from the 1940s. This is Maududi. Maududi also wrote a commentary on the Qur'an. In Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood was established by Hassan al-Banna in the 1920s. People like Sayyid Qutb were associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb also wrote a commentary on the Qur'an. As I said, political Islam or political Islamism is primarily interested in the political dimension of Islam. As I said, political Islam or Islamism is primarily interested in the political dimension of Islam. A key question for us is there a blueprint for Islamic State? There is, of course, no blueprint in the Quran or in the Hadith. Maududi, who is considered one of the key Islamists or political Islamists, had to write lots of pamphlets and papers in the 1930s and 40s explaining what an Islamic constitution was, what an Islamic state was, and what should be the rights of different citizens in an Islamic state. But his ideas were not accepted by some who follow Islamism or political Islam. In Pakistan alone, if you look at the literature on this idea of what an Islamic state is and the rights of citizens, a good number of scholars would say things like all citizens should have the same rights regardless of whether they are Muslim or not. Others would say Muslims in an Islamic state should have more rights than non-Muslims. Maududi had a similar idea that Muslims would have more rights in an Islamic state. But what about women? Some scholars would say men and women are equal in an Islamic state. Others would say women should not have a public role in society. What about freedom of religion? Some scholars would say it should be allowed in an Islamic state. Others would say it should be restricted. So there are a lot of different views about what an Islamic state is and how it should be conceptualized. Let us look at Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was a member of Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, and he was executed in the 1960s, primarily because of his writings. Sayyid Qutb's early writings were not about Islam or the Quran. He was a literary critic, not trained in traditional Islamic seminaries or Islamic universities. His writings are used these days by more extreme elements of political Islam or Islamism as their guide. For example, he's very influential, his ideas are very influential in various what we call Salafi jihadi groups. Sayyid Qutb wrote a lengthy commentary on the Quran called Fi Zilal al-Quran, or In the Shade of the Quran. It was translated into English and it is available on the internet. Again, his commentary is very different from classical Quranic commentaries. He simply reflects on the Quranic text and then relates it to contemporary issues and situations as he saw them. He refers to hadith and brings in ideas from various disciplines, that is, Islamic disciplines, but it's not a traditional commentary as such. It is more of a reflection on Quranic verses. Sayyid Qutb uses the term Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means the pre-Islamic times or the pre-Islamic context, the time before Islam. But he uses the term Jahiliyyah in a slightly different way. He refers to the general condition in which people are living today as Jahiliyyah, or akin to pre-Islamic times. This condition, he says, must be changed by using violence if necessary. Jahiliyyah is a state that exists whenever people revert to judging or legislating based on their own whims instead of God's law. For Sayyid Qutb, that's wrong. One should give prominence to God's word and to God's sovereignty and to God's law. He cites this particular verse: if any person fails to judge by what God has revealed, they are unbelievers. This is Sayyid Qutb's view of sovereignty. Rulers either implement God's law in totality and thus they remain within the area of faith, or they may enforce some other laws, secular laws. For example, if people accept God's rule and God's law and God's judgment administered by rulers and judges, then they are proper believers or proper Muslims. Otherwise, they are not. It's a very clear-cut case for him. There is no middle way between the two. Either you are in or you are not in. So how do political Islamists approach interpretation of the Quran? For them, interpretation of the Quran should follow the usual methods: linguistic analysis, reliance on other Quranic texts and Hadith texts, and so forth. But they are very keen on interpretation that lead to ideas that will help the Muslims today in areas such as politics, governance, management of societies in ways they consider to be Islamic. Islamization of society is a key part of their interest. Let us look at a couple of examples. On the interpretation of the Quranic concept of consultation, or in Arabic, shura, S-H-U-R-A, Maulana Maududi, who is one of the key Islamists, gives some suggestions, and he says, let me quote him: the Islamic way of life requires that the principle of consultation should be used in every collective affair, big or small. If it is a domestic affair, for example, the husband and the wife should act by mutual consultation. And when the children have grown up, they also should be consulted. If it is a matter concerning the whole family, the opinion of every adult member be solicited. If it concerns a tribe of a fraternity or the population of a city, and it is not possible to consult all the people, the decision should be taken by a local council or committee, which should comprise the trustworthy representatives of the concerned people according to an agreed method. If the matter concerns a whole nation, the head of government should be appointed by the common consent of the people, and he should conduct the national affairs in consultation with the leaders of opinion, whom the people regard as reliable, and he should remain at the helm of affair only as long as the people themselves want him to remain in that position. That's an interesting interpretation of the Quranic concept of shura. Let us now look at neo-modernism. Neo-modernism is considered the next evolution of modernism. Neo-modernism emerged perhaps from the mid-20th century. It is an offshoot of Islamic modernism. It emphasizes that the Quran is embedded in a socio-historical context, meaning that if you want to understand the Quran, you have to look at the 7th century Mecca and Medina and their social, political, and historical contexts. This is, of course, the starting point. Here we have a number of key figures of what we might call neo-modernism. This is Fazlur Rahman, originally from Pakistan, Amina Wadud from the US, Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, originally from Egypt, and Asma Barlas lives in the US. Of course, there are many others. For the neo-modernists, this idea of contextualization is a very important one. So what exactly is contextualization? Contextualization means that when you want to try to understand a Quranic text, you have to contextualize it. You have to understand the social, political, historical, cultural, and intellectual context of the verse at the time in the early 7th century in Mecca and Medina, and then try to make sense of that verse in relation to the modern context. This is what Fazlur Rahman had to say, for example, about riba, R-I-B-A. And you can see that he speaks about the original context of the verse. Riba, R-I-B-A, for many Muslims is equivalent to modern bank interest or interest on a loan. Of course, there are some Muslims who would disagree with this understanding, but riba as bank interest is a very widely held view among many Muslims. Now, Fazl Rahman says this, and I quote, here he is interpreting the concept of riba in the Quran in a modern context. He says, what made it riba was the increase in capital that raised the principal severalfold by continued redoubling. The situation, therefore, was that a part of wealth was loaned initially on interest for a definite period, but on the expiry of that period, in case the debtor was unable to pay, the term of payment was extended with an enormous increase in the principal amount. It often happened that where big sums were involved, the debtor went on paying interest alone in installments and yet could not pay off even the usurious interest, let alone being able to return the principal. In short, the riba of pre-Islamic days, which was categorically declared haram or prohibited by the Qur'an, so that those who indulged in it were threatened with war from God and His Prophet, was of an atrocious kind and went on multiplying in a manner that the poor debtor, in spite of his regular payments, could not pay off the usurious interest, let alone the capital. Now, this is an interesting reading or interpretation of the Quranic concept of riba. Fazlur Rahman is relating this concept to how the practice of riba was in pre-Islamic times, and then he is trying to say that in the modern period, if this kind of practices continue, then that still would be riba. But he also says that in the modern banking system, it is difficult to have this kind of arrangement. Whether one agrees with Rahman or not, that's how he is interpreting riba. So for him, when you try to understand riba today, you have to look at the current social, political, cultural, and intellectual context, of course, economic context, and try to relate the original principle at the back of the prohibition of riba to the modern context. Rahman is trying to interpret riba by trying to understand how riba was practiced in pre Islamic times. For him, that understanding is absolutely essential in order to relate this Quranic concept of riba to our modern times. He would want to see whether the current context is also similar to the context of pre Islamic times. And if that's the case, then the Quranic prohibition of riba as it existed in pre Islamic times should apply in the modern period. But if the current context is so different, then that standing has to be modified. For example, he would say things like modern bank interest in the very regulated banking setup could not be similar to pre-Islamic borrowing and lending. Let us look at Fazlur Rahman's double movement theory. Fazlur Rahman had this theory called double movement theory. For him, when the Quran provides a rule, a very specific rule, say, for example, in the case of inheritance, you need to look at that rule in the context of its time and place and find out the general principle that is behind this rule. In the case of inheritance, the Quran provided many rules, and one of its specific rules is that in certain cases of inheritance, a male, say a brother, gets double that of what a female or a sister gets. So here we have a brother and sister. The brother gets double of what the sister gets. For Rahman, it is not enough to look at the specific rule and leave it at that. One has to try to apply that rule today, of course, after first understanding that rule in the context of early Islamic times or pre-Islamic times. For Rahman, we need to look at what's behind this rule. What is the principle at work? For him, this Quranic ruling was primarily about fairness, or the principle of fairness is at play here. In pre-Islamic times, a female was not expected in general to have such inheritance. But the Quran says she should get a share. It's one of the reforms of the Quran. But given the way the societies worked at the time and the males had more financial responsibilities, Rahman would argue that the female got less than what the male got, but it was considered fair and just at the time. For Rahman, what we should look at is the principle behind that rule, not the specific rule as such. So, in interpreting this particular Quranic text about inheritance, Rahman says we have to make two moves. The first move is from the specific rule, in this case the inheritance rule, to the general principle behind that rule, that is fairness, the principle of fairness. The second move is from the general principle to another rule for another context, that is our time. So, based on this logic, the specific rule of inheritance made perfect sense in the early Islamic times. The principle was about fairness. If we use that principle to apply to inheritance today, Rahman would argue that the principle of fairness leads us to change the specific rule to one that is relevant to our time. This may mean that both the brother and sister today may be getting a similar share as the context has changed and both males and females today contribute to the expenses of the family and the like. This kind of interpretation obviously would make sense for the neo-modernists, but would be seen as highly problematic from a classical legal point of view as far as inheritance laws are concerned. When you look at neo-modernism or neo-modernists and their works on Quranic interpretation, you will find that there's quite a bit of influence of modern hermeneutics on their approaches to interpretation of the Quran. You can give example of Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, who is from Egypt, who is also associated with this particular approach to interpreting the Quran. He benefited a lot from modern literary theory and hermeneutics in his writings, and you can see quite a bit of that in his works. I won't go into the details of the modern influences on these figures, but this is something that we might need to keep in mind as we read neo-modernist works on the Quranic interpretation. Part of the neo-modernist approaches to interpretation of the Quran is the Muslim feminist interpretations. We have a separate lecture on that, and therefore I will not be covering that in this lecture. We'll be looking at figures such as Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas, and perhaps we should leave it at that in this lecture. So, in summary, the purpose of this lecture was to illustrate that in the modern period, there are a whole range of new approaches to interpreting the Quran. Of course, this is side by side with classical approaches to the Quran. These new approaches are the result of the modern context and changed values and norms. The modern context has forced Muslims to look at many things in their tradition. Many Muslim scholars are going through the process of rethinking and reinterpretation. Even the most traditional scholars are being forced to do this. If you look at what is happening in Islamic scholarship today, whether in Quranic interpretation or theology or philosophy or law, what you're seeing is the development of a lot of new thinking. The context is new. Many ideas and methods and tools that were taken for granted in the Islamic tradition in the past do not seem to be sufficient. So, Muslim scholars are compelled to develop new ideas, new principles, and new approaches to law, theology, and Quranic interpretation. Islamic tradition, of course, is very broad. It has lots of different trends and schools of thought within it. The modern period is no different. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Qur'an's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.